Good morning, good afternoon, or good night, and welcome to Command Power, the show in which we discuss all things Magic the Gathering with a focus on Commander. And today we have a brand new top 10 list for you. We're going to be listing the top cards of 2023. But before that, just a quick reminder to please click like and subscribe if you enjoy my videos. We're well on our way to 1 million subscribers and every single click counts. So before we get started with our first honorable mention, let me just say that 2023 has been an amazing year for Commander. We've seen so many good supplemental products, so many great decks, and so many unique creative designs that it's very difficult to pick the top 10, but we're going to try our best to do so. Also, I wanted to quickly remind you that this top 10 is my personal choice and it's based on the cards that I've been seeing pop up a lot in Commander so far, or that have brought something new or interesting to the format. So starting off with our first honorable mention, we have Everybody Lives from the Doctor Who Commander decks. This card is on the list not because it does something completely revolutionary, seeing as we've seen this kind of effect before in other cards such as Heroic Intervention or Flawless Maneuver or even Teferi's Protection, but rather because it does it in an interesting way that allows for a very different kind of plays. This is a card that is going to allow you to save your opponents if you want to, and there's not that many cards in Magic that allow you to do that. It also has some very interesting usage against infinite combos by stopping you from losing to them on the turn that they're going off. However, there is a very specific window that you can use this in, and I have been experiencing that a little bit with this card. It's not that good against combos that kill you little by little, that can reactivate themselves at instant speed, so this is not actually that good against something like an Aristocrats combo draining your life, because they just wait for you to pop this and then respond to this by sacrificing the stuff. That being said, it's still a really interesting and unique piece of design. I love the political aspect of it, and I think it merits a place in this honorable mention. For our second honorable mention, we have Etali Primal Conqueror. This card has been an absolute powerhouse every time I've seen it hit the board. It's one of the most busted ETBs we've ever had on a creature, and the fact that you can blink it and do all sorts of things to get the enter the battlefield trigger again just makes it that much more abusable. It is limited a little bit by the fact that it only goes in Gruul decks, but in a year in which we haven't had that many amazing red cards, this definitely stands out quite a bit, and that's even without talking about the flip side, which can just kill you on the spot if you forget about it. You can't afford to ever tap out or leave yourself vulnerable against a player that's got Etali in play, because as long as they have 9 mana available, you could just lose the game on the spot to Etali Primal Sickness. And with the two honorable mentions out of the way, we're going to move on to our top 10 proper, and we're starting out with Virtue of Persistence. Now, this card has been an absolute house since the moment it was spoiled, and I've seen it in so many games. And I think the reason that this has really been pushed over the edge is just the fact that it has the adventure. Without the adventure mode, this would just be a Debtor's Knell that could go in mono black decks, and that might have been good enough a few years ago, but these days, the way the format is shaping out and with how fast it is, it's just nowhere near good enough to just have a 7 mana enchantment that doesn't do anything until your next upkeep. But that's where the sorcery pod comes into play. It's such an incredibly powerful effect for 2 mana. Usually the sorcery pods on these kind of enchantments have a little bit of a weaker effect for the cost, but this one is pretty on par with what you're paying. For 2 mana, you're getting a removal spell that will kill most early game creatures and take some aggro off of you so that you can survive to play the enchantment. But not only that, it also gives you a nice little 2 life buffer, which actually makes it work in a lot of different decks as well, because there's a lot of decks that want to have a little bit of life gain synergy thrown in, and this just does so well in those kind of decks, particularly when you consider the fact that you have a game-winning enchantment on the flip side. It's just a really powerful effect that can go in every black deck, and that's why this card is worth quite a bit of money at the moment, and I think it merits the top 10 on this list. Moving on to number 9, we have another black card in Breach the Multiverse. Now, this card is absolutely everywhere. If Virtue of Persistence is a good reanimation card, then Breach the Multiverse is the card that gets it there in the first place, seeing as you're probably very likely to see both of these in the same deck. But Breach the Multiverse is so much more than a reanimation enabler. The fact that it gets you the 4 best creatures from all graveyards for just 7 mana would already be pretty good and would be very similar to Sepulchral Primordial, but not only does it do that, it also basically guarantees that you're never going to whiff by milling everybody 10 first. There's so many decks that want to be dumping cards into their graveyard. This reminds me a bit of Incarnation Technique, which is a card that is always played better than it looks, and some people were a bit skeptical of Breach the Multiverse when the first set dropped because they thought 7 mana was just too much to be paying for this kind of effect. It turns out that that's not the case, and this is an absolutely incredible effect. It also gets even better if you have cards in your deck that rebuy instants or sorceries from a graveyard, which a lot of people are running. So yeah, this is a great card with no synergy, but if you have any sort of synergy at all, this is an amazing 4-for-1. Moving on to number 8, we have Autumn Soldier but we're also adding in quantum misalignment and nanogene conversion since they do functionally similar things and go in the same kind of decks. The reason this card is here is because we've seen an absolute burst of cards that let you copy legendary creatures without them being legendary. These 3 cards all allow you to do that. Autumn Soldier is probably the best of the bunch if you want to keep the creature around because it gets to attack and then make extra copies of the creature, and since they're not legendary, they'll all stick around until end of combat. Quantum misalignment is still very powerful though, don't get me wrong. You're getting 2 copies of the creature if everything goes well, or you can just get another legendary creature if they've removed the first one by the time it gets back to your turn. Nanogene conversion is a really interesting one for Johnny players as well because it can win you the game out of nowhere by just copying your commander a bunch of times and turning all your tokens into copies of your commander. Do be aware with nanogene conversion that it is also going to turn all of your opponent's creatures into the same creature, which can be really hilarious at certain times. But Autumn Soldier is still the best of the bunch. It can also copy a creature you don't control, so if somebody has a really strong legendary in play, then you can just play Autumn Soldier, copy it, and when you attack with it, you're going to get multiple copies of that legendary. If you have a way to give it haste and copy something like Elish, Norn, Grand Cenobite, then this is just an absolutely crushing play. But all of these cards are great in blue strategies, particularly in those where you want to be copying your commanders, so I think they absolutely merit being in the top 8 spot on this list. Moving on to number 7, we have a card from the Lost Caverns of Ixalan, which is Tishana's Tidebinder. Now, it's mostly on this list because of its interaction with one of the other cards on the list, which you can probably guess, but it's just a very powerful effect in its own right, and when this card first came out, it made waves in a bunch of different formats. We don't often see the text loses all abilities on Magic cards, and it is super powerful, so it's very interesting to see it occurring on what is basically a counterspell for abilities. Countering abilities on a flash creature would already be great, but when you factor in that you're also neutering the card that the ability came from, it just becomes so much stronger, and this is really a steal at 3 mana as a 3/2. Not only that, but it has 2 very good card types, Merfolk and Wizard, which are both interested in playing stuff at instant speed, so this is never going to be at a loss for finding a home. But as we said, this definitely interacts very well with one of the top cards on our list, so stick around and you'll find out what that is. Moving on to number 6, we have another blue card, which is Fairy Mastermind. This card has been an absolute staple since the second it was printed. It keeps everybody else fair, and it makes sure that you're keeping up with them in cards. Even if they're drawing extra cards, you're going to get to draw an extra one too, and it actually triggers regardless of when they're drawing those cards, so they can draw 2 cards during their turn, then 2 cards during an opponent's turn, and you're going to draw an extra card on each of those instances, which makes this really strong. It also makes it very easily abusable with cards that force people to draw extra cards, such as wheel effects. But in case all of that wasn't enough, it has an activated ability which can allow you to trigger it on demand, basically, which just works so nicely, and it can even be used in a political way if you needed to, by offering people cards when they're trying to dig for answers or something like that. It's just a really flexible and powerful effect on a creature that has an excellent cost for what it does. A 2/1 flyer with flash is an excellent body, so tacking on this amazing ability onto that and not paying anything extra for it just seems like an absolute steal. Moving on to number 5, we have Agatha's Soul Cauldron, and this card has been a delight for Johnnies everywhere because of all the infinite combos that it opens up. It's actually seeing play in some Eternal formats because of its interaction with certain old cards, but it's just a really good card in general in Commander, particularly if you have any deck with +1/+1 counters as a theme, and that is largely because it has an exile ability stapled onto it. Having incidental graveyard hate in Commander is always amazing because it's one of the main ways that people can gain advantage late in the game, particularly the way the format is shaping up these days. And with this card, you're getting it at basically no additional cost. You're going to be playing this in any deck with +1/+1 counters anyway because it's going to give you so much more value, but then having that exile ability tacked on there makes sure that you don't randomly lose to some reanimation strategy or some really overpowered graveyard deck. So it's really nice that it has the infinite combo possibilities, but the graveyard hate is what pushes it over the top, and obviously being an artifact means that it can go in every deck. Moving on to number 4, we have another colorless card, and this one is a doozy. Roaming Throne has been an absolute powerhouse since it came out in Ixalan. It's certainly been one of my top cards from the set. I love playing this card. I feel that it works so well in all sorts of different strategies, and one thing to mention is that it doesn't need to go into tribal strategies at all. Obviously, it's at its best in those, but it can just go in any deck that has a commander with a triggered ability, and since you're always going to have access to your commander, then that means that you're always going to be able to double his triggered ability whenever you draw a Roaming Throne. With certain commanders, this can be absolutely broken, and it's an incredibly powerful special effect that is a bargain at just 4 mana. You're getting a 4/4 with Ward 2. That's also going to synergize with all your tribal cards, which is very nice. But I think the Ward 2 is really what makes it that much more powerful. It makes it so that your opponents are very unlikely to want to waste removal on this. They might eventually have to in certain situations, but most of the time they're just going to look for other targets because they don't want to pay the extra 2 mana, or they can't because it would require them to waste their turn. I think all of that makes this card incredibly flexible, and of course the fact that it's an artifact means that it can go in basically any deck with a commander with a triggered ability. This card is the real deal, and if you haven't picked it up, you should consider doing so because it's pretty much always going to be good in the format. Moving on to number 3, and probably to nobody's surprise, we have Orcish Bowmasters. This card has been an absolute menace of all sorts of different formats since it came out, and Commander is really no different. If you're playing in any playgroup with a slightly higher power level, you've probably seen this card already because it just does so much for what it costs. The fact that it has an ETB trigger on top of its triggered ability means that there's never a situation where this isn't going to at least be decent. You're getting 2/2 worth of stats and 1 damage to anything for 2 mana at flash speed, which is already excellent. But when you factor in that opponents drawing extra cards turbocharges this, then it just becomes so much more broken. I will say that I don't actually think it's as broken as people think it is. I think it's mostly a fair card that's trying to keep other broken stuff from happening, but that doesn't stop it from sometimes getting completely out of hand. In my opinion, if somebody is playing a spell to draw 20 cards, though, it's fair play to drop this in response and hit them in the face for 20 and knock them out of the game potentially, because drawing 20 cards just isn't a fair thing to do. So I think it does fight fire with fire in a way, but there is no denying that this card is incredibly powerful. Moving on to number 2, we have Mondrak Glory Dominus, and this one is a card that I think almost everybody knew was going to be fantastic because we've seen many token doubling effects in the past and they're basically always excellent. I don't think anyone predicted just how good this was going to be, however, because this has been omnipresent, at least in my playgroup. We see this all the time. People play this card in all sorts of different decks because it just does so much and it's so difficult to remove. That's really what gives it the edge over other cards such as Anointed Procession or Parallel Lives. The fact that you can just pay 1 mana and 4 life and get rid of 2 random tokens, and then suddenly Mondrak is indestructible, just makes it so difficult to deal with. Making this kind of creature indestructible is really broken because you have a static effect that is very hard to remove at that point. Most commander decks aren't equipped to deal with indestructibility that easily, so you only have 2 or 3 effects maybe in your deck that can do so, and you're not necessarily going to have them, or you might have used them already. This means that Mondrak often sticks around a lot more than he has any right to, which means you're going to reap all sorts of benefits from this. And honestly, if this card sticks around for a few turns and you have any kind of token making, you're probably going to run away with that game. It's a super strong effect, which combined with the fact that it's incredibly hard to remove makes it number 2 of our list, but it just narrowly loses out the number 1 spot to the One Ring. Now this should be absolutely no surprise to anyone at all. This card has warped the entire Magic metagame in basically every format it is legal, and it's no different in Commander. Basically, this is almost as much of an auto-include as something like Sol Ring if you're just going for pure power. You have to actively look for a reason to not want to run this card. And not only that, it synergizes with all sorts of different things. It synergizes with decks that are interested in drawing a lot of cards. It synergizes with decks that want to be losing life, and there's quite a few of those. It synergizes with decks that can bounce this to your hand because it then makes it very difficult for you to be killed. It just synergizes with a lot of different things, and it's obviously great in any deck that's gaining life as well, because the main downside to the card is that it does end up costing you a lot of life, but if you're gaining a ton of life every turn, then this just has close to no downside. But again, just like with Mondrak Glory Dominus, the biggest issue with the card is the fact that it's indestructible. It makes it so hard to remove. In so many games, somebody's just gonna drop this, and if you don't have any way to put them out of the game very quickly, they're just going to eventually bury you in absolute mountains of card advantage, particularly if they have any way to gain life or to proliferate the counters on this. Due to how popular this card has become, other cards that answer it have become better, such as Tishana's Tidebinder, which was in our top 10 list, and even something like Thieving Skydiver is something that I'd recommend playing these days, because for 6 mana you can steal an opponent's the One Ring, and it's going to keep all the burden counters it had on it, so you're going to immediately turbocharge your card draw, That being said, this card isn't remotely fair, and again, if you own it, you're going to really struggle to find a reason not to put it in your deck. It's just that good, and there are rumors that it might one day even be considered for a ban from the Commander format, although I don't necessarily see that happening. So there you have it. That has been our top 10 cards of 2023 list. What do you think about this one? Do you agree with my inclusions? Do you think there's any cards that I missed? Let me know in the comments section below. I read all comments and respond to all of them too.
And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click like or subscribe. It really helps the channel. And until next time, take care.